I didn't lose my marriage the day she left. I lost it while we were still living together, sharing the same bed, the same kitchen, the same quiet routines. She stayed. That's what made it confusing. No affairs exposed, no packed bags, no dramatic confrontations, just a gradual shift I couldn't name at first. She stopped arguing with me, and I mistook that for peace. She stopped asking my opinion, and I told myself she was independent. But one night, sitting across from her at the dinner table, I realized something that hit harder than anger ever could. She wasn't unhappy. She was done. And I was still showing up every day, playing a role that no longer existed. That's when I understood something terrifying. You don't always notice when you stop being someone's husband. Sometimes you realize it only after you've already become a background character in your own marriage. At first, I was almost relieved. We weren't fighting anymore. No slammed doors, no accusations, no long nights of tension. Just quiet. I told myself this was what mature love looked like. Two adults who finally learned how to stop hurting each other. But the quiet had a strange texture to it. It wasn't calm. It was empty. She stopped telling me small things, the kind that don't matter, but somehow mean everything. What made her laugh at work? What annoyed her in the store? What she was thinking while driving home? Our conversations became updates, bills, schedules, who's picking up what. Whenever I tried to talk about us, she didn't get angry. She got polite. And politeness in a marriage is a warning sign no one talks about. Because when someone still cares, they risk emotion. They argue. They push back. They fight for space. When someone is done, they don't fight. They manage you. They keep the peace. They keep the routine. And while I was grateful for the silence, she was using it to disappear right in front of me. I noticed it in decisions that used to be ours. She booked things without asking, changed plans without explaining, decided first, informed me later. At first, I didn't protest. I told myself it wasn't worth creating tension over small things. But small things add up when they all point in the same direction. When I offered an opinion, she nodded. The way you nod at someone who's finished talking. Not disagreement, dismissal. She wasn't pushing against me anymore. She was stepping around me. I realized I had become predictable, safe, easy to manage, not because I was a bad husband, but because I had stopped insisting on being part of the decision-making. And here's the truth that took me too long to admit. You don't lose your place in a marriage overnight. You lose it every time your voice becomes optional. I wasn't excluded loudly. I was quietly overridden. And the scariest part? I started doing it to myself too. Editing my thoughts, lowering my expectations, telling myself this was just how things were now. That's how a man disappears, without ever leaving the room. The house still looked the same. Same furniture, same routines, same evenings. But something essential was missing. Presence. She moved through rooms like someone passing time, not sharing space. Always occupied. Always somewhere else, even when she was right next to me. I tried to reconnect in quiet ways, cooking dinner, suggesting walks, asking about her day without expecting much. She answered kindly, briefly, like someone being courteous to a colleague. There was no cruelty in it. That's what made it harder to name. Cruelty gives you something to fight against. Indifference just drains you. At night, we lay in the same bed, backs turned slightly, not in anger, but in habit. I realized then that intimacy doesn't disappear when touch stops. It disappears when curiosity does. She wasn't curious about me anymore, and I was slowly learning how to stop asking for space that no longer existed. That's when I understood the real problem. I wasn't lonely because I was alone. I was lonely because I wasn't chosen anymore, even while sharing the same life. I started changing without realizing it. I softened my opinions, lowered my expectations, chose timing carefully, or not at all. Anything to avoid disturbing the fragile calm we had built. I stopped bringing up things that mattered to me, dreams, frustrations, doubts, not because they disappeared, but because they felt unwelcome. I became agreeable, flexible, easy to live with, and she seemed to appreciate that. But appreciation isn't connection, it's convenience. The more I adapted, the less room there was for me as a person. I wasn't showing up as a husband anymore. I was showing up as a problem prevention strategy. That's when I realized something painful. I wasn't keeping the peace for us. I was keeping it for her. And in doing so, I was slowly erasing myself from the relationship. You don't lose a marriage only when someone leaves. Sometimes you lose it when you become so careful that there's nothing left to lose. I thought trying harder would bring me back into focus. I became more attentive, more helpful, more present in ways that didn't ask for anything in return. I fixed things before she noticed them, handled problems quietly, removed friction wherever I could, and she thanked me. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Gratitude replaced engagement. Acknowledgement replaced interest. She appreciated what I did, but she no longer engaged with who I was. I realized effort doesn't create closeness when closeness is no longer wanted. It just makes you easier to overlook. I wasn't being taken for granted. I was being taken as a given. Predictable, reliable, emotionally safe. And safety without desire slowly turns into background noise. I started to feel like a feature of the house. Useful, familiar, rarely questioned. That's when it hit me. I wasn't failing as a husband. I was succeeding at being invisible. And once someone stops noticing you, no amount of effort will make them see you again. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back. Not because I looked older, but because I looked smaller, careful, measured, always adjusting. I realized how much energy I spent anticipating her moods, choosing words that wouldn't trigger distance, timing conversations so they wouldn't feel like pressure. I wasn't walking on eggshells. I was living on them. Friends asked how things were at home. I said fine, and believed it, because admitting the truth felt like admitting failure. But the real failure wasn't the marriage weakening. It was me shrinking to keep it standing. I had traded authenticity for stability. And stability, it turned out, was an illusion. That's when I understood something I wish I'd known earlier. You can lose yourself long before you lose the relationship. And when that happens, saving the relationship won't bring you back. I didn't know how to fix us yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep disappearing and call it love. I started noticing the distance in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. She no longer reacted when I entered a room. No shift in energy. No pause in what she was doing. I could have left the house for hours and returned without being missed. When something good happened to me, I hesitated before sharing it. Not out of fear, but because I already knew the response. A smile. A polite, "That's nice." Then the conversation would move on. I realized I had become emotionally inconvenient. My inner life no longer fit into hers. And that's when it became clear. Distance isn't created by space. It's created when one person stops making room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She had simply reorganized her world so that I was no longer at the center of it. And once someone does that, they don't need to push you away. They just let gravity do the work. I was still there, still present, still trying. But for the first time, I stopped asking how to bring her closer and started asking a harder question. What had it cost me to stay this far away from myself? There was a quiet shift the day I stopped trying to fix the distance, not because it stopped hurting, but because I finally understood what I was chasing. I wasn't trying to reconnect. I was trying to be chosen again. And that's not something effort can force. I noticed how often I initiated everything: conversations, plans, gestures, how rarely anything came back without prompting. That imbalance became impossible to unsee. I realized that closeness offered out of obligation isn't closeness at all. It's maintenance. So I pulled back, not dramatically, not to punish her, but to observe. And what I saw was clear. Nothing collapsed, nothing changed, because what we had left was already running on autopilot. That's when I accepted a truth that hurt more than rejection. If your absence doesn't change the dynamic, your presence hasn't been needed for a long time. And in that realization, something in me stopped reaching outward and began turning inward for the first time in years, not because I wanted to give up, but because I wanted to give in. Once I stopped reaching, the silence became honest, not heavier, clearer. I noticed how little changed when I gave her space. No confusion, no concern, no question about what was wrong. She simply continued. That's when it became undeniable. I wasn't withdrawing from a partnership. I was stepping away from a role that had already ended. I had been alone for a long time, just not physically. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being next to someone who no longer sees you as part of their emotional world. I used to believe loneliness meant emptiness. Now, I understood. It meant absence of recognition. She didn't need me to be gone. She had already learned how to live without engaging with me. And in that moment, something shifted. I wasn't panicking anymore. I wasn't strategizing. I was accepting. Not because I wanted to give up, but because fighting for something that no longer includes you only teaches you how invisible you've become. That acceptance didn't solve anything, but it finally told me the truth. Acceptance didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust after a long collapse. I stopped imagining conversations where things magically changed, stopped rehearsing words I would never say, and she would never hear. Hope had been my last attachment, not hope for love, hope for recognition. Letting go of that was harder than letting go of her. I noticed how much mental space opened up once I stopped waiting, waiting for warmth, waiting for curiosity, waiting to matter again. Without hope, the situation became simple. Not easy, simple. I wasn't unloved. I was unchosen. And that distinction mattered, because being unloved invites bargaining. Being unchosen demands dignity. I began sleeping better. Not longer, but deeper. My body finally understood what my mind had been avoiding for months. Nothing was wrong with me for wanting connection, but something was wrong with staying where connection was no longer possible. That realization didn't push me to leave. It pushed me to stand still and see the truth clearly for the first time. Standing still felt unnatural at first. I wasn't fixing. I wasn't adjusting. I wasn't performing calm. I was simply present, with myself, without the constant effort to maintain peace. I began to notice how much of my energy had been spent anticipating her reactions instead of living my own life. I started taking walks alone, not to think, but to feel where my body had been holding tension for years. I noticed how often I had swallowed words before they ever reached my mouth. How many decisions I had delayed just to avoid discomfort. Standing still didn't make her come closer, but it made me clearer. I wasn't angry. I wasn't dramatic. I was finally honest. Honest about the fact that love shouldn't require constant self-editing. That partnership shouldn't feel like a test you're always failing quietly. By not moving, I saw the shape of the relationship without distortion, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what that shape told me. It wasn't empty. It was finished. Once I stopped trying to change it, I could finally see it, not as a failure, not as a tragedy, but as something that had quietly reached its end. I looked back at the last few years without defending either of us. She hadn't become cruel. I hadn't become weak. We had simply stopped meeting each other in the same emotional place. I realized how often I had confused loyalty with endurance, how staying had become proof of love, even when love was no longer being exchanged. The marriage wasn't collapsing anymore. It was complete. And there's something unsettling about that word. Complete doesn't mean successful. It just means finished. I didn't need a villain to explain what happened. I didn't need a dramatic reason. Two people can share a history and still reach a point where continuing would require one of them to disappear completely. And I finally understood why I felt so tired all the time. I wasn't exhausted from conflict. I was exhausted from pretending there was still something to fight for. Seeing the truth didn't break me. It steadied me. I didn't make a grand decision that day. There was no announcement, no line drawn in the sand. I simply stopped abandoning myself. I stopped agreeing to things that drained me, stopped minimizing what I felt to keep the atmosphere light, stopped acting like my needs were unreasonable. Nothing on the outside changed immediately. The routine stayed intact. The house stayed quiet. But inside, something shifted. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Not to speak, not to want more, not to be fully present as myself. I realized how often I had confused sacrifice with love, how easily I had believed that being low maintenance made me easier to keep. It doesn't. It just makes you easier to overlook. Choosing myself didn't mean leaving her. It meant returning to a version of me that hadn't been asking to be tolerated. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was grounded. And for the first time in a long while, the calm in the house didn't feel fragile. It felt honest. She noticed it before I said anything. Not because I became distant, but because I stopped orbiting. I no longer adjusted my schedule automatically. I didn't rush to fill silences. I didn't explain myself in advance. The calm I carried was different now. Not cautious, not apologetic. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes, and meant it. That answer confused her more than any accusation would have. Because I wasn't withdrawing to provoke a reaction. I was stabilizing myself. I realized then how much of our dynamic had depended on my constant availability, my readiness to smooth things over, my willingness to bend. When that stopped, the structure changed, not dramatically, subtly. I wasn't trying to be noticed. I was simply no longer shrinking. And whether she leaned in or not was no longer the measure of my worth. That realization didn't end the marriage, but it ended something else. The quiet agreement that my needs came second. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was choosing how I showed up. Once I stopped watching for her response, I felt something loosen inside me. I hadn't noticed how much of my emotional energy was tied to reading her face, anticipating tone, adjusting myself in advance. Without that constant monitoring, my days felt longer, not heavier. I wasn't performing calm anymore. I was calm. She didn't suddenly move closer. No, she didn't pull away either. And that neutrality told me everything I needed to know. Because real connection responds. It reacts. It reaches back. What we had now was coexistence, not conflict, not closeness. I realized I had been measuring my progress by whether she noticed me. That was the last habit to break. Healing doesn't require validation from the person who benefited from your silence. I didn't need her to acknowledge the change for it to be real. I needed to feel it in my body, in the way I slept, the way I breathed, the way my thoughts no longer circled around her absence. That's when I understood. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to live. Whether she stayed or not, something unexpected happened once my focus shifted inward. My world got bigger, not louder, not more exciting, just wider. I started reconnecting with parts of myself that had been paused for years. Old interests, unfinished ideas, friendships I had neglected without realizing it. I didn't talk about the marriage much, not out of secrecy, but because it stopped being the center of every thought. I noticed how differently I carried myself, not defensive, not cautious, present. People responded to that. Not dramatically, naturally. I wasn't looking for attention. I was available to life again. And that's when it became clear how much of my identity had been wrapped around being a good husband instead of being a whole person. I hadn't lost myself because she changed. I lost myself because I stopped checking in with who I was while trying to keep everything stable. Stability had cost me expansion. Now, expansion felt unfamiliar, but right. And for the first time, I wasn't measuring my days by how connected we were. I was measuring them by how honest I felt living them. With distance came clarity. I began to understand that real partnership isn't built on endurance. It's built on participation. Two people choosing each other, not once, but repeatedly, especially when it's uncomfortable. What we had at the end wasn't broken communication. It was absent curiosity. She wasn't interested in who I was becoming, and I had spent too long trying to remain who I used to be for her comfort. That realization wasn't bitter. It was grounding. I stopped blaming myself for wanting more presence, for wanting to be asked, noticed, included. Those aren't excessive needs. They're basic signals of connection. I also stopped blaming her for not offering them, because people don't withhold what they value. They simply invest elsewhere, emotionally or inwardly. Understanding this didn't reopen old wounds. It closed them properly. I wasn't rejected for being inadequate. I was left behind because the relationship could no longer hold two evolving people. And once I accepted that, the idea of forcing closeness felt unnecessary, even unfair to both of us. I stopped trying to define the ending, not as a failure, not as a lesson wrapped in regret, just as a conclusion that didn't need drama to be real. We still shared space, still exchanged words, but the story had already resolved itself internally. I realized how often we chase explanations because we want pain to feel justified. But not everything ends because someone did something wrong. Some things end because they've stopped growing. I didn't need a confession. I didn't need closure in the form of a final conversation. What I needed was permission from myself to stop waiting for a version of the relationship that no longer existed. Letting the ending be quiet didn't make it smaller. It made it honest. I wasn't erasing the years we shared. I wasn't rewriting history. I was simply allowing the present to stop pretending to be something else. And in that acceptance, there was no bitterness, just a calm understanding that some chapters close without a sound, and that doesn't make them any less complete. I didn't leave that marriage in a dramatic way. There was no explosion, no final speech. What ended wasn't our shared address. It was the version of me that kept disappearing to keep things calm. I stayed present, but I stopped abandoning myself, and that changed everything. I no longer needed to be chosen to feel whole. I no longer needed proof that I mattered. I mattered because I was still here, thinking, feeling, living honestly. If this story sounds familiar, it's because many endings don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as peace, disguised as maturity, disguised as, this is just how things are now. But love doesn't fade into silence. It fades into absence. And the moment you stop recognizing yourself is the moment something important has already ended. I didn't lose my marriage all at once. I lost myself slowly. And then I found myself again. Not louder, not harder, just clearer. And that clarity was the beginning of everything that came after.